Hi, everyone. It's me, Tim. Today, I want to talk about what it's like to be a game director. Now, this is what it's called now. It used to be called the project leader. Sometimes in the 90s, producer meant the person who was really running the show, or it was the lead designer. But they've really consolidated a lot of these roles now. And game director is what's usually used as the person who, or creative director sometimes, is the person who's running the project. It's kind of like the showrunner on a TV show. Basically, this is the person who has the vision for the game being made. That doesn't mean people on the team don't share that vision. But if you think of it as a boat, there's one person at the wheel who's steering, and he's usually either the captain or he's taking his, the choices he's making are coming from the captain. I don't think you'd want to be on a boat where anybody could run up at any time to the wheel and turn it. You're either going to hit an iceberg or run aground on a sandbar. Something bad is going to happen. You probably won't get to your destination. But this means that directors have to make all the really tough decisions. And not all of these decisions are objective. There are subjective decisions that have to be made. And because of that, you sometimes just have to say, I'm declaring this is what we're doing. It's a fiat. I heard, I think Josh Sawyer once called it the benevolent dictator. And you have to do this because sometimes there are people that just will not let an idea go. For example, Outer Worlds, I was co-director with Leonard. And that is one of the rare situations where I think you can have multiple directors. And that's because we divided up the work. We both worked on setting and story. And then I went off and did system mechanics, and Leonard did art and narrative. This worked for us because we totally trusted each other in what the other one was doing, and we let them have the final say and the autonomy in that. Now, we had an open door policy at Obsidian. This meant we had lots of people come in and argue our decisions. And I will admit, a few times we changed our mind. We went, okay, that's a good idea. We should do that. But there were a lot of hours lost to people who simply would not let it go, that their decision was subjective. Let's say mine was subjective. And I win. I'm the director. I win. Lost hours and hours and hours to people talking about that. Now, I thought those were productive hours because if you can get someone convinced you're right, the feature you're talking about will probably end up being better. If they're making it, they're all in. If they're not making it, they're not going to the person making going, isn't this dumb? Don't you wish it was done another way? Isn't this the stupidest feature you've ever seen? Which has happened on many, many games I've worked on. But because Leonard and I were co-directors, I had an interesting vantage point I'd never had before where I got to watch another director I can only call it mansplained. That's the best thing, even though the artist doing it was a woman. She did not agree about our art style. She wanted to be more like Fallout 1. She proceeded to explain the art style of Fallout 1 to Leonard. Now, Leonard and I shared an office, so I was working. I had eventually stopped working and just watched Leonard. I listened to her, but watched Leonard as she explained why that art style was better than the one we were using, and we should be using it. Now, there were a lot of reasons we did the art style we did on the Outer Worlds. She wasn't having any of it. Now, I'm the last person in the world who's ever going to explain art styles to anybody. Forget my colorblindness. I'm aesthetic blind. It's probably why I'm good at playing gray box levels, but I don't think I've ever tossed my controller aside or walked away from my keyboard because I thought a game looked bad. I basically will play anything if I think it's fun to play. So it was interesting, this discussion, because I didn't feel like I really had any skin in that game. But it was so odd watching someone explain the art style to someone who created that art style. And in the end, Leonard had to say what I had to say to some designers, which is, I hear what you're saying. I understand it. We're not doing it. We're just not doing it. And that's something you have to do because as the director, you're going to end up taking responsibility for almost everything in the game after it ships, whether you decided it or not, whether you even liked it or not. Because once the game goes out, unless it's like a bug that needs to be fixed or something that's imbalanced, you can't really just go and say, yeah, I wish I had done something else there. Sorry. Now, you will correct it in the sequel. And of course, this applies to things that you were involved in. For example, and I think I've said this somewhere, I was in an interview and they asked if Outer Worlds, this is before Outer Worlds had shipped, if they asked if it was going to be on Steam. And I said, sure, it's going to be on Steam. Weeks later, Private Division and Epic made a decision all by themselves that no, it wasn't going to be on Steam. It was going to be an Epic exclusive for a year. Money changed hands, decisions were made. Leonard and I were not involved in this. I don't even think Obsidian was involved in this. But people got really angry and there were a lot of comments. Tim lied. Tim lied in that interview. I didn't lie. I said something which later on turned out not to be true that I had nothing to do with. And that made me mad. I remember telling the communications guy at the time, you know what? I'm just going to pass on PR for a while. If you or Private Division wants me to do something, my answer is no. I'm just not going to do it for a while. Because I was mad. But that's pretty much all you can do. Eric DeMille calls it me taking my football and going home. I've only done that twice. Like in a big way. When I walked away from Fallout 2 and when I walked away from WildStar. Which I guess at some point I'm going to have to do a whole video about Carbine. Carbine was one of the best places and worst places I've ever worked simultaneously smashed into one company. It's a wild story. It's also very long. So anyway, what I'm saying is when you're a game director, you have to take responsibility for a lot of things that you ultimately had the decision for, so you had the responsibility for, even if you don't necessarily think that's the way I would have done it. You have a bigger goal in mind as a director. You want the ship to get to its destination, to go back to that analogy. Maybe you would have gone left around that sandbar instead of right, but your navigator convinced you that they had the right idea. And sometimes their navigator's right. Sometimes the navigator's wrong. But if you run against the sandbar, people are going to blame the captain. That's just how it works. Frustratingly, in the last few years that I was at Obsidian and was involved in hiring people, I saw more and more people apply directly to be a lead or a director with no experience. And it kind of, I was like, where are they getting this like incredible ego from? Because if they have talent to match that ego, this person's going to be a powerhouse. I rarely saw that combination, but I finally asked somebody who had no experience. He was fresh out of school. Why do you think you can be a tech director? And he said, well, look at all the projects I was tech director on. And I was like, you've never been a tech director? He goes, oh yeah. And he started pointing at school projects. And I was like, these are school projects. This has no bearing on being a tech director on a professional project. He goes, oh, it's exactly the same. And I'm like, did you hire these people? Could you fire them? Did you adjust their salaries? How is this in any way like being a real tech director? Did you have to deal with, press or marketing? Or did you have to make decisions that were completely outside of your purview because the decisions weren't being made and deadlines were up? It was a strange conversation. And I finally got him to say that his professor had told him to do that. And I said, you have that professor call me because what you are doing is tantamount to fraud. Saying you had tech director experience when all you've done is run a school project is fraud. And if any of your professors, if you're a student and a professor tells you to do that, tell them to stop. Because if it's somewhere I work, I'm going to put the kibosh on that. And I even talked to some of my tech director friends at other companies and said, has this been happening? A few of them like, yeah, that's been happening. So we talk about it and we all agree, stop doing it. So what's the moral of this story? When you're a game director, you will quickly learn that there are not always objective decisions you have to make. Sometimes there are subjective ones. And this gave me new insight when, after being a game director on projects, when I went back to being a team member, like I did on South Park and Pillars of Eternity and Tyranny, I had a rule because I didn't want the people to think, oh, Tim's just going to take over the project. No, I didn't want to. My rule was, if the game director ever made a decision I didn't agree with, I talked to them privately about it one time. And I would say, I really think this isn't the right decision. And I tried to frame it objectively, but sometimes I'd have to just say, I just don't agree with this. I think it will lead to these things. Sometimes I would get the director to change their mind, but there were several times they said no, and I said, okay, I'm not going to bring this up again. I broke that rule one time about something I felt so strongly about that I went to the game director a second time and went, I know I said I'd only come once, but I'm going to talk about this one more time because I see what I said happening. And they agreed it was happening. They just didn't think it was a big deal, which is what I mean about objectivity versus subjectivity. And I see this in reviews. I see this when people talk about games they don't like. You're confusing your taste with objective reality, even when you think you're not. I've seen people go, well, this game crashed too much. It objectively sucks. Well, how much is too much? What about this other person who just goes, oh, I just saved the game a lot. Doesn't affect me. Are they wrong? Are you wrong? Basically, they found a way to enjoy a game that you could not. The game is good to them and it is bad to you. That is subjective. There are a few objective things that can go bad. If there's a game where, like in my personal thing, if there's a game that you can make a character build in an RPG that literally can't finish the game, that's bad. If this used to be a big problem in RPGs in the 80s and 90s, if you could destroy a quest item completely accidentally, that's bad. It's bad even if it's a good game. Ultima Underworld, looking at you, when I accidentally clicked to give someone a quest item, and I didn't click on them, I clicked next to them, which it interpreted as throw, and I threw a quest item in lava, and it burned up. The game was now no longer completable, and I had to go back to a save game from about an hour and a half before. My bad for not making frequent saves. Their bad for putting in a mechanic like that. But whether that bad mechanic led to a bad game is completely subjective, which is why, when I talked about yesterday why I didn't do reviews, that's why I find reviewers I like, and I use their judgment on past games to decide if they align with me, and then I use that to decide whether I want to buy a game. And that's why I find it strange when people hate a game so much they feel like it's their duty to go around and say, this game is horrible, everyone needs to stop buying, it's my duty to the world. Well, the problem is nobody really knows who you are. And unless you really have a defined way of doing your reviews and all the basis of your reviews that people can look at, they don't know if your opinion matters to them. Maybe you hate a game because it doesn't have a lot of color in it, and I'm not going to care about that. And that's also why it's important as a director. So my other moral is you have to have some people below you that you utterly trust to fill in the gaps in where you know you're bad. I know I'm not a good narrative writer, especially for dialogues. Find good ones. I know I'm not that good at balancing. Find someone who's good at that. So, as a director, you have final say, you have final authority, but you always don't make the final decision because you sometimes have to rely on someone else who you think knows better than you. But you do take the final responsibility for that. So I think any of you who want to get into game development and want to eventually be a game director have to understand this. You will make most of the decisions, but you will take all of the responsibility. And the final decision is yours. Even if your final decision is, I'm going to go with what that guy's saying, because I know I'm bad. It's an interesting balancing act. It does get tiring, which is why for a while I didn't want to be a director anymore. I just wanted to go back to what I liked, which is doing code and a little design on the side. It is fun to eventually be a director. It's not for everybody. But I hope if you want to get into game development, start lower down and watch. Find the good directors and watch them. And I think you will find that the way they steer the boat is, if you end up at a good destination, a lot of it was how that boat was steered.